Football is a vicious sport, but believe it or not, it was even worse 120 years ago. Not only was it vicious, it was fatal. Until President Theodore Roosevelt stepped in to make the game a little bit safer. I'm Bob Summers, and this is a presidential story. The first college football game was played in 1869 between Princeton and Rutgers. It featured up to 25 players per team on the field at the same time, and a lot of running plays. Rutgers won 6-4. It was also the first game to feature a heckler. A Rutgers professor yelled to one of the Princeton players, "You will come to no Christian end." Scathing. Roosevelt saw his first game in 1876 between Yale and his Harvard Crimson. This was also the first game to limit the number of players on each side to 11. It was a tight 1-0 affair, with Yale coming out on top. Roosevelt was immediately a fan of the rough and tumble sport. However, the sport had some problems. The play was excessively violent. There were fatalities on the field. The teams could bring in non-student athletes as ringers to beat up the opposition. And there were recruiting scandals and corrupt referees. How violent was this game? Punching, kicking, and eye gouging were common strategies, as was the flying wedge, where players could link arms, form a V, and with a running start careen downfield, running over their rivals. But if the defender wanted to cause a fumble, they could just choke the player until they dropped the ball. All of this was within the rules, and the players only had a leather cap and minimal padding to protect themselves. Although Roosevelt never played, his 4 sons did. He thought football, played honestly, cultivated important masculine qualities. "In life as in a football game," he wrote, "the principle to follow is hit the line hard, don't foul, and don't shirk, but hit the line hard." This philosophical connection to football may be why 10 of the Rough Riders commanded by Roosevelt in Cuba listed their occupation as football player. This was 20 years before the introduction of the NFL. In 1903, Harvard College president Charles Eliot, the head of Roosevelt's alma mater, criticized football in his annual report. Eliot, like a growing number of the public, was calling for football to be outlawed. But Eliot could not outlaw it at Harvard himself because the alumni and the students controlled the athletic committee, and every year they kept voting to play. Roosevelt shared his response with an audience by saying, "I believe in rough games and in rough, manly sports. I do not feel any particular sympathy for the person who gets battered about a good deal, so long as it is not fatal." But it was fatal. In the 1904 season alone, the Chicago Tribune reported that in addition to 159 serious injuries, there were also 18 football deaths. To put this in perspective, today there are 5 times the number of college football players, which would mean 90 football deaths in a season, or 8 per week over an 11-game regular season. Appalling. In September 1905, before the start of the new fall season, President Roosevelt received a letter from Endicott Peabody of Groton, the school where all 4 of his sons were attending. Peabody insisted that the teaching of football at the universities is dishonest, and asked the president to use his bully pulpit to convince coaches to stop teaching underhanded plays. Roosevelt did not want to see the sport banned, but he could read the country and could see the direction this was heading. So in typical Roosevelt fashion, he got involved. On October 9th, 1905, Roosevelt called the coaches of the 3 largest football programs in the country, Yale, Princeton, and Harvard, along with the heads of their respective alumni committees, to meet with him and his Secretary of State, Elihu Root. Even though he had no authority to make them do anything, Roosevelt asked these leaders to save the sport and set an example by reducing violence in whatever way they could figure out amongst themselves. At the end of the meeting, the men issued a statement denouncing on-field brutality and pledging to keep the game clean. In that 1905 season, there were 19 college football players who died from their on-field injuries, including internal bleeding, concussions, spinal injuries, and blood poisoning. Newspapers dubbed the 1905 season as the Death Harvest. One of those in 1905 with non-fatal injuries was Roosevelt's own son, Ted Jr. In a Harvard freshman game, he suffered a cut over his eye and a broken nose which required surgery. Some say he was specifically targeted. Now, the public outcry could no longer be ignored. The universities themselves came together to debate the sport's future. Some schools wanted to amend the rules to make the game safer, while others thought the sport was beyond salvation. Columbia, Duke, Northwestern, and New York University, among others, banned the sport. Others, like Stanford and the University of California, switched to the more gentle sport of rugby. Eventually, the universities formed the Intercollegiate Athletic Association, which 4 years later would become the NCAA, and they agreed to 19 new rules intended to make football safer. Some examples of these rules were the doubling of the yardage needed for a first down from 5 to 10 yards, which would make plunging down the field like a tank less successful. Creating a neutral zone along the line of scrimmage, requiring 6 members on the line of scrimmage to prevent a running start for the flying wedge, and establishing the forward pass to spread out the players on the field. The influential former Yale coach Walter Camp was known as the father of American football for his role in the sports rules and development. Camp was at odds with the Harvard coach, Bill Reed. Camp, who hated the passing game, believed the rule changes would make the game less physical and therefore less entertaining. Reed, on the other hand, knew that if significant changes were not made, Harvard President Eliot would ban the game completely. Reed informed Roosevelt that Camp ran the Rules Committee with a member of the U.S. Naval Academy faculty, Paul Dashiell. Reed suggested that Roosevelt pressure Dashiell to accept the rule changes. After all, the Naval Academy belonged to the executive branch. Once Dashiell accepted the changes, Camp would also have to accept. In the meantime, Reed pressured Camp directly by threatening to cancel Harvard's football program if Yale did not accept the new rules. The Harvard-Yale game was so popular, Camp could not be the person responsible for ending the rivalry. Once the rules were accepted for the 1906 season, fatalities declined to 11, which was still a lot. There were 11 more in 1907, and then a spike of 26 fatalities in 1909, which led to even more reforms. Rule changes for football players' safety have continued to be implemented. For example, the NFL has added late hit penalties to protect the quarterback, and kickoffs from the 35-yard line to increase touchbacks and decrease dangerous kick returns. Bill Reed later said, "Except for this chain of events, there might now be no such thing as American football as we know it. You asked me whether President Theodore Roosevelt helped save the game. I can tell you that he did." Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please help out the channel, like and subscribe, and please visit POTUS.com to learn more interesting facts about the presidents.